All food of animal origin contains hormones. But most of our dietary exposure to hormones comes from dairy products. By quantity, it's mostly prolactin, corticosteroids, and progesterone. But there are also a bunch of estrogens, which then concentrate further when you make other dairy products, like 5 times more concentrated in cream and cheese, 10 times more hormone concentration in butter. So when it comes to exposure to steroid hormones in the food supply, about 3/4 of our exposure to ingested female sex steroids comes from dairy, with the rest evenly split between eggs and meat and fish. Eggs contribute about as much as all meat put together, which makes a certain amount of sense, since it comes straight from a hen's ovary, right? Among the various types of meat, you get as much from white meat, fish and poultry, as you do from pork and beef. And this is just from natural hormones, not added hormone injections like bovine growth hormone. So for these, it doesn't matter if the meat's organic. Animals produce hormones because they're animals, which understandably ends up in animal products. But only about half of people surveyed seemed to know that, lacking basic knowledge, like not realizing what milk is for. Cows only give milk after having a calf. So these researchers suggested we ought to inform the public about dairy production practices, to which one journal of dairy science respondent wrote, telling the public all our new technologies, like transgenic animals, meaning genetically engineered farm animals, or taking away that calf right away so we can have more of the milk, or not letting cows see grass, may not actually result in high rates of public approval, so ixnay on the education nay. One thing with potential public health implications that the public may not know about is their exposure to estrogen through intake of commercial milk produced from pregnant cows. See, modern genetically improved dairy cows, such as the Holstein, your standard black and white cow, can get re-impregnated after giving birth and lactate throughout almost her entire next pregnancy, which means that commercial cow's milk these days contains large amounts of pregnancy hormones like estrogens and progesterone. Here's the estrogen levels in milk during the first 8 months of a pregnant cow's 9-month gestation. Hormone levels shoot up more than 20-fold. But even so, we're still only talking about a millionth of a gram per quart, easily 10 to 20 times less estrogen hormones than what you'd find in like a birth control pill. So would it really have an effect on human hormone levels drinking it? Here are the average levels of 3 different estrogens and a progesterone metabolite flowing through the bodies of 7 men who then proceeded to drink about a liter of milk. Within hours, their hormone levels shot up. Here are the average levels of these female sex steroids flowing through the bodies of 6 school children, average age 8, before drinking about 2 cups of milk. And then after. Within hours, their levels shot up, tripling or quadrupling their baseline hormone levels. So one can imagine the effects milk might have on men or prepubescent children, but what about women? Presumably they have such high levels of estrogens in their body in the first place. Well, not all women. What about postmenopausal women, and endometrial cancer, for example? Estrogens have a central role in the development of endometrial cancer, which is a cancer of the lining of the uterus. Milk and dairy products are a source of steroid hormones and growth factors that might have these kinds of effects. So Harvard researchers followed tens of thousands of women and their dairy consumption for decades, and found significantly higher risk of endometrial cancer among postmenopausal women who consumed more dairy. What about dietary exposure to hormones and breast cancer? Unfortunately, understanding the role of dietary hormone exposure in the population burden of breast cancer is not possible at this time. The first surgical attempt at body sculpting was in 1921, with a dancer wanting to improve the shape of her ankles. The surgeon apparently scraped away too much tissue and tied the stitches too tight, resulting in necrosis, amputation, and the first recorded malpractice suit in the history of plastic surgery. Today's liposuction is much safer, only killing about 1 in 5,000 patients, mostly from unknown causes, throwing a clot off into your lung or perforations of your internal organs. Liposuction currently reigns as the most popular cosmetic surgery in the world, and its effects are indeed only cosmetic. A study published in the New England Journal of Medicine assessed obese women before and after having about 20 pounds of fat sucked out of their bodies, resulting in nearly a 20% drop in their total body fat. Normally, lose even just 5 to 10% of your body weight in fat, and you get significant improvements in blood pressure, blood sugars, inflammation, cholesterol, and triglycerides. But liposuction sucks. None of those benefits materialized even after the massive liposuction. This suggests subcutaneous fat, the fat under our skin, is not the problem. The metabolic insults of obesity arise from the visceral fat, the fat surrounding or even infiltrating our internal organs, like the fat marbling our muscles and liver. The way you lose that fat, the dangerous fat, is to take in fewer calories than you burn. Anyone who's seen the Biggest Loser shows knows with enough calorie restriction and exercise, hundreds of pounds can be lost. Similarly, there are cases in the medical literature of what some refer to as super-obesity, in which individuals lost up to 374 pounds largely on their own, without professional help, and kept it off for years. The guy lost about 20 pounds a month, cycling 2 hours a day and reducing intake to 800 calories a day, which is down around what some prisoners were getting at concentration camps in World War II. Perhaps America's most celebrated TV weight loss was when Oprah pulled out a wagon full of fat representing the 67 pounds she lost on a very low-calorie diet. How many calories did she have to cut to achieve that within 4 months? Consult leading nutrition textbooks, or refer to trusted authorities like the Mayo Clinic, and you'll learn the simple weight loss rule. 1 pound of fat is equal to 3,500 calories. Quoting from the Journal of the American Medical Association, a total of 3,500 calories equals 1 pound of body weight. This means if you decrease your intake by 500 calories daily, you will lose 1 pound per week. 500 calories per day times 7 days equals 3,500 calories, so 1 pound of body fat. The simple weight loss rule, that's simply not true. The 3,500 calorie rule can be traced back to a paper in 1958 that just noted that since fatty tissue on the human body is 87% fat, a pound of body fat would have about 395 grams of pure fat. Multiply that by 9 calories per gram of fat gives you that 3,500 calories per pound approximation. The fatal flaw that leads to dramatically exaggerated weight loss predictions is that the 3,500 rule fails to take into account the fact that changes in the calories inside of the energy balance equation automatically lead to changes in calories out. For example, the slowing of metabolic rate that accompanies weight loss, known as metabolic adaptation. That's one of the reasons weight loss plateaus. For example, imagine a 30-year-old sedentary woman of average height who weighs 150 pounds. According to the 3,500 calorie rule, if she cuts 500 calories out of her daily diet, she'd lose a pound a week, or 52 pounds a year. In 3 years, then, she would vanish. She'd go from 150 pounds to -6. Obviously, that doesn't happen. What would happen is that in the first year, instead of losing 52 pounds, she'd likely lose only 32 pounds, and then, after a total of 3 years, stabilize at about 100 pounds. This is because it takes fewer calories to exist as a thin person. Part of it is simple mechanics. In the same way a Hummer requires more fuel than a compact car, think how much more effort it would take to just get out of a chair, walk across the room, or climb a few stairs carrying a 50-pound backpack. That's no lighter than carrying 50 pounds in the front. Even when you're lying at rest sound asleep, there's simply less of your body to maintain as we lose weight. Every pound of fat tissue lost may mean 1 less mile of blood vessels your body has to pump blood through every minute. So the basic upkeep and movement of thinner bodies takes fewer calories. So as you lose weight by eating less, you end up needing less. That's what the 3,500 calorie rule doesn't take into account. Or imagine it the other way. A 200-pound man starts eating 500 more calories a day. That's like a large soda or 2 donuts. According to the 3,500 calories rule, in 10 years, he'd weigh more than 700 pounds. That doesn't happen because the heavier he is, the more calories he burns just existing. If you're 100 pounds overweight, that's like the skinny person inside you trying to walk around balancing 13 gallons of oil at all times, or lugging around a sack containing 400 sticks of butter wherever you go. It takes about 2 donuts worth of extra energy just to live at 250 pounds, and so that's where he'd plateau out if he kept it up. So weight gain or weight loss given a certain calorie excess or deficit is a curve that flattens out over time rather than a straight line up or down. Nevertheless, the 3,500 calorie rule continues to crop up, even in obesity journals. Public health researchers used it to calculate how many pounds children might lose every year if, for example, fast food kids' meals swapped in apple slices instead of French fries. They figured 2 meals a week could add up to about 4 pounds a year. The actual difference, National Restaurant Association-funded researchers were no doubt delighted to point out, would probably add less than half a pound, 10 times less than the 3,500 calorie rule would predict. The original article was subsequently retracted. We have millions of years of evolution hardwiring us to survive scarcity. Compensatory survival mechanisms our body uses to defend against weight loss. So when we start losing weight, we may unconsciously start moving less as a behavioral adaptation to conserve energy. There are metabolic adaptations as well. Our metabolism slows down. Every pound of weight loss may reduce our resting metabolic rate by 7 calories a day. This may only translate to a few percent differences for most, but can rapidly snowball for those who achieve massive weight loss. During one season, some of the Biggest Loser contestants famously had their metabolic rates tracked. Above and beyond the hundreds of calories less it takes to just exist 100+ pounds lighter, by the end of the season their metabolic rate slowed by an extra 500 calories a day. The mind-blower was that 6 years later they were retested and still had the 500 calorie a day handicap. So the contestants had to cut 500 calories more than anyone else their size to maintain the same weight loss. No wonder the bulk of their weight was regained. Most remained at least 10% lower than their starting weight, though, and even a 7% drop has been shown to cut diabetes rates about in half. Still, the metabolic slowing means you have to work that much harder than everyone else just to stay in place. Analyzing 4 seasons of The Biggest Loser minute by minute, researchers noted that 85% of the focus was on exercise rather than diet, though the exercise component accounted for less than half of the weight loss. Even 6 years after their season ended, the contestants had been maintaining an hour of daily, vigorous exercise, yet still regained most of the weight. Why? Because they started eating more. They could have cut their exercise to just 20 minutes a day and still maintain 100% of their initial weight loss if they would have just been able to keep their intake to under 3,000 calories a day. That may not sound like much of a challenge, but weight loss doesn't just slow your metabolism, it boosts your appetite. If it were just a matter of your weight settling at the point at which your reduced calorie intake matches your reduced calorie output, it would take years for your weight loss to plateau. Instead, it often happens within 6 to 8 months. You may know the drill. Start the diet, stick to the diet, and then weight loss stalls 6 months later. What happened? Don't blame your metabolism. It just plays a small part. What happened is that you likely actually stopped sticking to your diet because your appetite went on a rampage. Let's break it down. If you cut 800 calories out of your daily diet, 2,600 calories a day down to 1,800, and your weight loss stalls after 6 months, then what happened is that at the end of the first month you think you're still cutting 800 calories, but you may actually only be down about 600 calories a day. By month 2, you're only down about 500, month 3, 300, and by month 6, you're only eating 200 calories less than before you went on the diet. In other words, you inadvertently suffered an exponential increase in calorie intake over those 6 months. Yet you may not even realize it, because by that time your body may have ramped your appetite up 600 calories, so it still feels as though you're eating 800 calories less, but it's actually only 200. Since an 800-calorie drop in intake may slow your metabolism and physical activity about 200 calories a day, with no difference between calories in and calories out at 6 months, no wonder your weight loss grinds to a complete halt. The slow upward drift in calorie intake on a new diet is not because you got lazy. Once your appetite is boosted by 600 calories after dieting for a while, eating 200 calories less at the end is as hard as eating 800 calories less at the beginning. So you can maintain the same disciplined level of willpower and self-control and still end up stagnating. To prevent this from happening, you need to maintain the calorie deficit. How is that possible in the face of a ravenous appetite? Hunger is a biological drive. Asking someone to eat smaller portions is like asking someone to take fewer breaths. You can white-knuckle it for a bit, but eventually nature wins out. That's why I wrote How Not to Diet. There are foods that can counter the slowing of our metabolism and suppress our appetite. Ways of eating to counter the behavioral adaptation and even eat more food, yet still lose weight. Due to the metabolic slowing and increased appetite that accompanies weight loss, sustained weight loss requires a persistent calorie deficit of 300 to 500 calories a day. This can be accomplished without reducing portion sizes, simply by lowering the calorie density of meals. This can result in the rare combination of weight loss with both an increase in quality and even quantity of food consumed. I'm going to do a whole series of videos about it. The bottom line is that sustainable weight loss is not about eating less food, it's about eating better food. If the 3,500 calories per pound weight loss rule is bunk, what's the alternative? How many fewer calories do you have to eat, or how many more do you have to burn to lose a pound of fat? There are validated mathematical models that take into account the dynamic changes that occur when you cut calories, such as the metabolic slowdown, and they've been turned into free online calculators that you can use to make personalized estimates. There's the Body Weight Planner from the National Institutes of Health, and the Pennington Biomedical Research Center's Weight Loss Predictor out of Louisiana State University. Here are the two direct links. Here are some shortened URLs. The NIH Body Weight Planner has been found to be more accurate since the LSU model appears to overestimate the drop in physical activity, but they both have their own pluses and minuses. The Body Weight Planner tells you how many calories you need to restrict, and/or how much more exercise you need to do to achieve a specific weight loss goal by a specific date. If you click on the Switch to Expert Mode button, you can get a graph, an exportable chart, showing your day-to-day weight loss trajectory. So if you're a middle-aged, sedentary, average-height woman, obese at 175 pounds, who wants to be closer to her ideal weight within a year, 2,000 calories a day would prevent future weight gain. About 1,400 calories a day would bring your weight down like this, and then you could maintain that lower weight at 1,700 calories a day. If in addition you walked a mile a day, it would give you a little more calorie leeway. The LSU Weight Loss Predictor, on the other hand, doesn't allow you to tweak physical activity, but the advantage is that you don't have to choose a goal or time frame. Just put in different calorie changes, and it graphs out your expected course. Is there any easy rule of thumb you can use? Yes. every permanent 10-calorie drop in daily intake will eventually lead to about 1 pound of weight loss, though it takes about a year to achieve half the total weight change, and about 3 years to completely settle into the new weight. So, cutting 500 calories a day can cause the 50-pound weight loss predicted by the 3,500-calorie rule, but that's the total weight loss at which you plateau, not an annual drop. And it takes about 3 years to get there. A 500-calorie deficit would be expected to cause about a 25-pound weight loss the first year, and then an additional 25 over years 2 and 3. That's only if you can maintain the 500-calorie deficit, though. If you're eating the same diet that led to the original weight problem, but just in smaller servings, you should expect your appetite to rev up about 45 calories per pound lost. So if you were cutting 500 calories a day through portion control alone, before you were down even a dozen pounds, you'd feel so famished that you'd be driven to eat 500 calories more a day, and your weight loss could vanish. That's why if you're dead set on eating the same diet, the same foods, but just in smaller quantities, you have to cut down an additional 45 calories per pound of desired weight loss to offset your hunger drive. So to get that 1 pound off, instead of just 10 calories less per day, using the 10 calories per pound rule, you'd have to eat 10 calories less on top of the 45 less to account for the revving of your appetite. So 45 plus 10 equals 55. So just changing diet quantity and not quality, it takes 55 calories less per day to lose a pound. So that 500-calorie daily deficit would only net you about a 9-pound weight loss over time instead of 50. That's why portion control methods can be such a frustrating failure for so many people. The obesity epidemic may just be the tip of the iceberg in terms of excess body fat. It's been estimated that 91% of adults, 9 out of 10 of us, and 69% of children in the United States are quote-unquote overfat, defined as excess body fat sufficient to impair health. That can occur even in normal weight individuals, often due to excess abdominal fat. The way you tell if you're overfat is if your waist circumference is more than half your height. What's causing this epidemic? One primary cause may be all the added sugars we're eating. A century ago, sugar was heralded as one of the cheapest forms of calories in the diet. Just 10 cents worth of sugar could furnish thousands of calories. Harvard's sugar-pushing nutritionist bristled at the term empty calories. The calories in sugar were not empty, but full of energy. In other words, full of calories, which we are now getting too many of. The excess body weight of the U.S. population corresponds to about a 350 to 500 calorie excess daily caloric intake on average. So to revert the obesity epidemic, that's how many calories we have to reduce. OK, so which calories should we cut? That's just how many calories the majority of Americans who fail to meet the dietary guidelines sugar limit get in added sugars every day. 25 teaspoons, about 400 calories. Even the most die-hard sugar defenders, like James Rippey, who is reportedly paid $40,000 a month by the high-fructose corn syrup industry, on top of the $10 million they paid for his research, even Dr. Rippey considers it indisputable that sugars contribute to obesity. It's also indisputable that sugar reduction should be part of any weight loss program. And of all sources of calories to limit, since sugar is just empty calories, contains no essential nutrients, reducing sugar consumption is obviously the place to start. And again, this is what the researchers funded by the likes of Dr. Pepper and Coca-Cola are saying. The primary author, Richard Kahn, is infamous for his defense of the American Beverage Association, the soda industry. He was chief science officer at the American Diabetes Association when they signed a $1 million sponsorship deal with the world's largest candy company. Maybe the American Diabetes Association should rename itself the American Junk Food Association. But what do you expect from an organization that was started with drug industry funding? The bottom line is that randomized controlled trials show that increasing sugars intake increases calorie intake, and this leads to body weight gain in adults, and sugar reduction leads to body weight loss in children. For example, when researchers randomized individuals to either increase their intake of table sugar or decrease their intake, the added sugar group gained about 3.5 pounds over 10 weeks, whereas the reduced sugar group lost about 2.5 pounds. A systematic review and meta-analysis of all such ad libitum diet studies, meaning real-life studies where sugar levels were changed, but people could otherwise eat whatever they wanted, reduced intake of dietary sugars resulted in a decrease in body weight, whereas increased sugars intake resulted in a comparable increase in weight. The researchers conclude that, considering the rapid weight gain that occurs after an increased intake of sugars, it seems reasonable to advise people to cut down. Findings from observational studies have been more ambiguous, though, with an association found between obesity and sweetened beverage intake, but failing to show consistent correlations with sugary foods. Most such studies rely on self-reported data, however, and obese people tend to underreport sugar-rich foods. One can measure trace sucrose levels in the urine, however, to not only get an objective measure of actual sugar intake, but to exclude contributions from other sweeteners, such as high-fructose corn syrup. When researchers have done this, they discover that sugar intake is indeed not only associated with greater odds of obesity and greater waist circumference on a snapshot-in-time cross-sectional basis, but in a prospective cohort study over time. Using urinary sucrose as a measure of sucrose intake, those in the highest versus lowest fifth for sucrose intake had more than a 50% greater risk of being overweight or obese. Denying evidence that sugars are harmful to health has evidently been at the heart of the sugar industry's defense. But when the evidence is undeniable, like the link between sugar and cavities, they switch from denial to deflection, like trying to switch attention from restricting intake to coming up with some kind of vaccine against tooth decay. We seem to have reached a similar point with obesity, with the likes of the Sugar Bureau switching from denial to deflection by commissioning research suggesting obese individuals would not benefit from losing weight, a stance contradicted by hundreds of studies across 4 continents involving more than 10 million participants. Though a bane for dieters, a slower metabolism may actually be a good thing. We've known for more than a century that calorie restriction can increase the lifespan of animals, and the metabolic slowdown may be the mechanism. That could be why the tortoise lives 10 times longer than the hare. Rabbits can live 10 to 20 years, whereas Harriet, a tortoise evidently collected from the Galapagos by none other than Charles Darwin himself in the 1830s, lived until 2006. Slow and steady may win the race. One of the ways your body lowers your resting metabolic rate is by creating cleaner-burning, more efficient mitochondria, the power plants that fuel our cells. It's like your body passes its own fuel efficiency standards. These new mitochondria create the same energy with less oxygen and produce less free radical exhaust. After all, your body is afraid famine is afoot, and so is trying to conserve as much energy as it can. The largest caloric restriction trial to date indeed found both metabolic slowing and a reduction in free radical-induced oxidative stress, both of which may slow the rate of aging. The flame that burns twice as bright burns half as long. But whether this will result in greater human longevity is an unanswered question. Caloric restriction is often said to extend the lifespan of every species studied, but that isn't even true of all strains within a single species. Some scientists don't think calorie restriction will improve human longevity at all. Others suggest a 20% calorie restriction starting at age 25 and sustained 52 years could add 5 years onto your life. Either way, the reduced oxidative stress would be expected to improve our health span. Members of the Calorie Restriction Society, self-styled cronies for calorie-restricted optimal nutrition, appear to be in excellent health, but they're a rather unique self-selected bunch of individuals. You don't really know until you put it to the test. Enter the Calorie Study, the comprehensive assessment of long-term effects of reducing intake of energy, the first clinical trial to test the effects of caloric restriction. Hundreds of non-obese men and women were randomized to 2 years of 25% calorie restriction. They only ended up achieving half that, but lost about 18 pounds and 3 inches off their waists, wiping out more than half of their visceral abdominal fat. That translated into significant improvements in cholesterol levels, triglycerides, insulin sensitivity, and blood pressures. 80% of those who were overweight when they started were normal weight by the end, compared to a 27% increase in those who became overweight in the control group. In the famous Minnesota starvation study that used conscientious objectors as guinea pigs during World War II, the study subjects suffered, both physically and psychologically, experiencing depression, irritability, and loss of libido. The subjects started out lean, though, and had their calorie intake cut in half. The calorie study ended up being 4 times less restrictive, only about 12% below baseline calorie intake, and enrolled normal weight individuals, which in the U.S. these days means overweight on average. As such, the calorie subjects experienced nothing but positive quality-of-life benefits, with significant improvements in mood, general health, sex drive, and sleep. They only ended up eating about 300 fewer calories than they were eating at baseline. So they got all these benefits, the physiological benefits, the psychological benefits, all from only cutting about a snack-sized bag of chips worth of calories from their daily diets. What happened at the end of the trial, though? In the Minnesota starvation study, and calorie deprivation experiments done on Army Rangers, as soon as subjects were released from restriction, they tended to rapidly regain the weight, and sometimes even more. The leaner they started out, the more their body seemed to drive them to overeat to pack back on the extra body fat. In contrast, after the completion of the calorie study, even though their metabolism was slowed, they retained about 50% of the weight loss 2 years later. They must have acquired new eating attitudes and behaviors that allowed them to keep their weight down. After extended calorie restriction, for example, cravings for sugary, fatty, and junky foods may actually go down. One of the most consistent benefits of calorie restriction is blood pressure improvements, in as short as 1 or 2 weeks. Blood pressures can sometimes even be normalized in a matter of weeks, and blood pressure pills discontinued. Unfortunately, this can work a little too well and cause something called orthostatic intolerance, which can manifest as lightheadedness or dizziness upon standing, which in severe cases can cause fainting. Staying hydrated can help. What about loss of muscle mass? In the calorie trial, 70% of the lost body weight was fat, and 30% lean body mass, so they ended up with an improved body composition. 72% lean mass compared to 66% in the control group. Though leg muscle mass and strength declined in absolute terms, relative to their new body size, they generally got stronger. Is there any way to preserve even more lean mass, though, particularly among older individuals who naturally tend to lose muscle mass with age? Increased protein intakes are commonly suggested, but most studies fail to find a beneficial effect on preserving muscle strength or function, whether you're young or old, active or sedentary. For example, researchers randomized overweight older men and women to a normal protein diet, 4 grams for every 10 pounds of body weight, or a high-protein diet, about 8 grams per 10 pounds during a 25% calorie restriction. That doubling of protein intake had no discernible effect on lean body mass, muscle strength, or physical performance. Most such studies found the same lack of benefit, but put them all together, and one can tease out a small advantage, about a pound or 2 difference over an average of 6 months. Unfortunately, high protein intakes during weight loss has been found to have profoundly negative metabolic effects, for example, undermining the benefits of weight loss on insulin sensitivity. Lose 20 pounds and you can dramatically improve your body's ability to handle blood sugars, compared to a control group that maintained their weight. Lose the exact same amount of weight, but on a high-protein diet, getting about an extra 30 grams a day, and it's like you never lost any weight at all. Though you can always bulk back up after weight loss, the best way to preserve muscle mass during weight loss is exercise. The calorie study had no structured exercise component, and like after bariatric surgery, about 30% of the weight loss was lean mass. In contrast, that proportion was only about 16% in Biggest Loser contestants, chalked up to their vigorous exercise program. Resistance training, even just 3 times a week, can prevent more than 90% of lean body mass loss during calorie restriction. The same may be true of bone loss. Lose weight through calorie restriction alone, and you experience a decline in bone mineral density in fracture risk sites such as the hip and spine. In the same study, though, those randomized to lose weight with exercise didn't suffer any bone loss. The researchers conclude our results suggest that regular exercise should be included as a part of a comprehensive weight loss program to offset the adverse effects of calorie restriction on the bone. You can never argue with calls for increased physical activity, but even without an exercise regimen, the very small drop in bone mineral density in the calorie trial might only increase a 10-year risk of osteoporotic fracture by only about 0.2%. The benefits of calorie restriction revealed by the study— improved blood pressures, improved cholesterol, improved mood, improved libido, improved sleep— would seem to far outweigh any potential risks. The fact that a reduction in calories seemed to have such wide-ranging benefits on quality of life led commentators in the AMA's Internal Medicine Journal to write, "The findings of this well-designed study suggest that intake of excess calories is not only a burden to our physical equilibrium, but also to our psychological well-being as well." Regular apple consumption may contribute to a lower risk of dying prematurely. Moderate apple consumption, meaning like an apple or 2 a week, was associated with a 20% lower risk of dying from all causes put together, whereas those who ate an apple a day had a 35% lower risk. You'll often hear me talking about a lower or higher risk of mortality. But what does that mean? I mean, isn't the risk of dying 100% for everyone eventually? Let's look at some survival curves to help visualize. If you follow thousands of older women over time, for example, you might see a survival curve like this. They all start out alive, but over a period of 15 years, nearly half succumb. OK, but this is the survival curve of those who rarely, if ever, ate apples, less than 20 a year. Those averaging more than like a half a small apple a day instead fell off like this. Over the same time period, closer to only about 40% died, and those who ate an apple a day, 1 small apple or about a quarter of a large apple a day, did even better, survived even longer. Why is that the case? It seems to be less the apples of one's eye than the apple of one's arteries. Even a fraction of an apple a day is associated with a 24% lower odds of having severe major artery calcifications, a marker of vascular disease. And if you're like, duh, it's a fruit, of course it's healthy, the effect was not found for pears, oranges, or bananas. Both these studies were done on women, but a similar effect was found for men. For apples and onions, we think because of the flavonoids, naturally occurring phytonutrients concentrated in apples, thought to improve artery function and lower blood pressure, leading to improvements in blood flow throughout your body and brain, thereby decreasing the risk of heart disease and strokes. But you don't know until you put it to the test. When I first saw this paper on testing flavonoid-rich apples, I assumed they had selectively bred or genetically engineered some special apple, but no. The high flavonoid apple was just an apple with its peel on, compared to the low flavonoid apple, which was just the exact same apple, but with the peel removed. Over the next 3 hours, flavonoid levels in the bloodstream shot up in the unpeeled apple group compared to the peeled apple group, which coincided with significantly improved artery function, peeled versus unpeeled. They conclude that the lower risk of cardiovascular disease with higher apple consumption is most likely due to the high concentration of flavonoids in the skin, which improve artery function, though it could be anything in the peel. All we know is that apple peels are particularly good for us, improving artery function and lowering blood pressure. Even compared to spinach? Give someone about 3/4 of a cup of cooked spinach, and within 2 to 3 hours their blood pressure drops. Instead, eat an apple with some extra peel thrown in, and you get a similar effect. The researchers conclude that apples and spinach almost immediately improve artery function and lower blood pressure. What's nice about these results is that we're talking about whole foods, not some supplement or extract, so this could easily translate into a natural and low-cost method of reducing the cardiovascular risk profile of the general population. I've got more videos coming out on other natural low-cost methods for preventing and treating our leading killers, so keep your eyes peeled, but keep your apples unpeeled. I talked about the benefits of calorie restriction. Well, the greatest caloric restriction is no calories at all. Fasting has been branded the next big weight loss fad, but has a long history throughout various spiritual traditions practiced by Moses, Jesus, Mohammed, and Buddha. In 1732, a noted physician wrote, "He that eats till he is sick must fast till he is well." Today, about 1 in 7 American adults report taking that advice, using some sort of fasting as a means to control body weight. Case reports of the treatment of obesity through fasting date back more than a century in the medical literature. In 1915, 2 Harvard docs indelicately described 2 extraordinarily fat women, one of whom was a, quote, veritable pork barrel. Their success led them to conclude that, quote, moderate periods of starvation constitute a perfectly safe, harmless, and effective method for reducing the weight of those suffering from obesity, unquote. The longest recorded fast, published in 1973, made it into the Guinness Book of World Records. To reach his ideal body weight, a 27-year-old man fasted for 382 days straight, losing 276 pounds, and managed to keep nearly all of it off. He was given vitamin and mineral supplements so he wouldn't die, but no calories for more than a year. In their acknowledgments, the researchers thanked him for his cheerful cooperation and steadfast application to the task of achieving a normal physique. A U.S. Air Force study of about 20 individuals, at least 100 pounds overweight, most unable to lose weight on previous diets, were fasted for as long as 84 days. 9 dropped out of the study, but the 16 who remained were unequivocally successful at losing between 40 and 100 pounds. In the first few days, subjects were noted losing as much as 4 pounds a day, and that was mostly water weight as the body starts to adapt. But after a few weeks, they were steadily losing about a pound of mostly straight fat a day. The investigator described their starvation program as a dramatic and exciting treatment for obesity. Of course, the single most successful diet for weight loss, namely no diet at all, is also the single least sustainable. What other diet can cure morbid obesity in a matter of months, but practically be guaranteed to kill you within a year if you stick with it? The reason diets don't work, almost by definition, is that people go on them, and then they go off of them. Permanent weight loss is only achieved through permanent lifestyle change. So what's the point of fasting if you're just going to go back to your regular diet and gain it all right back? Fasting proponents cite the psychological benefit of realigning people's perceptions and motivation. Some individuals have resigned themselves to the belief that weight loss for them is somehow impossible. They may think they're just made differently in some way, and no matter what they do, the pounds don't come off. But the rapid, unequivocal weight loss during fasting demonstrates to them that with a large enough change in eating habits, it's not just possible, but inevitable. This morale boost may then embolden them to make better food choices once they resume eating. The break from food may allow some an opportunity to pause and reflect on the role food is playing in their lives, not only the power it has over them, but the power they have over it. In a fasting study entitled Correction and Control of Intractable Obesity, a person's personality was described as changing from one of desperation with abandonment of hope to that of an eager extrovert full of plans for a promising future. She realized that her weight was within her own power to control. They concluded, this highly intellectual social worker has been returned to a full degree of exceptional usefulness. After a fast, newfound commitments to more healthful eating may be facilitated by a reduction in overall appetite reported post-fast compared to pre-fast, at least temporarily. Even during a fast, hunger may start to dissipate within 36 hours. So challenging people's delusions about their exceptionality to the laws of physics with a period of total fasting may seem barbaric, but in reality this method of weight reduction is remarkably well tolerated by obese patients. That seems to be a recurring theme in these published series of cases. In this influential paper, Treatment of Obesity by Total Fasting for up to 249 days, the researchers remarked that the most surprising aspect of the study was the ease with which the prolonged fast was tolerated. All their patients evidently spontaneously commented on their increased sense of well-being throughout the process, even in some cases frank euphoria. Though it's essential that fasting should only be prescribed under close medical supervision, they concluded that they were convinced that it is the treatment of choice, certainly in cases of gross obesity. Fasting for a day can make people irritable, moody, and distracted, but a few days in, many report feeling clear, elated, and alert, even euphoric. This may be in part due to the significant rise in endorphins that accompanies fasting. Mood enhancement during fasting is thought to perhaps represent an adaptive survival mechanism to motivate the search for food. This positive outlook towards the future may then facilitate the behavioral change necessary to lock in some of the weight loss benefits. But is that what happens? Is it actually effective over the long term? And I'm sure you saw titles like this flash by. Is it even safe? We'll find out next. Fasting obviously causes consistent, dramatic weight loss, but how do fasted individuals do long-term? Some research groups reported extremely disappointing results. Here's what they saw. Average subjects started out at about 270 pounds, and in the 6 months before the fast continued to gain weight, as obese persons tend to do. Then after 24 days of what they called inpatient starvation, a dramatic 27-pound weight loss. Then what do you think happened? They gained it all back, and more. Though one could argue if they had not fasted, they might have been up around here at that point. In another study with follow-ups ranging up to 50 months, only 4 out of 25 so-called super-obese patients achieved even partial sustained success. Based on these kinds of data, some investigators concluded that complete starvation is of no value in the long-term treatment of obese patients. Other research teams reported better outcomes. One series of about 100 individuals found that 60% either retained at least some weight loss at follow-up or even continued losing. The follow-up periods varied from 1 to 32 months, with no breakdown as to who fasted how long, though making the data hard to interpret. 1 year after fasting 62 patients down 16 pounds in 10 days in another study, 40% retained at least 7 pounds of that weight loss. Put 6 such studies together, and hundreds of obese subjects fasted for an average of 44 days, lost an average of 52 pounds, and around 1 or 2 years later, 40% retained at least some of that weight loss. So most gained all their weight back, but 40% is extraordinary for a weight loss study. Follow 100 obese individuals getting treated at a weight loss clinic with a standard, low-calorie diet, and researchers found only 1 out of 100 lost more than 40 pounds, only about 1 in 10 even lost 20 pounds, with the overall successful weight maintenance at only 2% over 2 years. That's why having a control group is so important. What may look like a general failure may actually be a relative success compared to more traditional weight loss techniques. Researchers new to the field may find it clearly disappointing that a year later 2/3 were failures, with more than a third regaining all their weight they had initially lost, but 12% were labeled successes, maintaining 59 pounds of weight loss 2 years later. They lost massive amounts of excess weight and kept it off. In a direct comparison of different weight loss approaches at the same clinic, 5 years after initiating a conventional low-calorie approach, only about 1 in 5 was down 20 pounds, compared to nearly half in the group who instead had undergone a few weeks of fasting years previously. By year 7, most of those instructed on daily caloric restriction were back to or had exceeded their original weight, but that was only true of about 1 in 10 of the fasted group. In an influential paper in the New England Journal of Medicine on 7 myths about obesity, fallacy number 3 was that large, rapid weight loss is associated with poorer long-term weight loss outcomes as compared with slow, gradual weight loss. In reality, the opposite is true. The hare may end up skinnier than the turtle. Researchers set up a study comparing the sustainability of weight loss at 3 different speeds: 6 days of fasting, versus 3 weeks of a very low-calorie diet, 600 calories a day, or 6 weeks of a low-calorie diet, 1,200 calories a day. The question is, what happened a year later? A year later, the fasting group was the only one that sustained a significant loss of weight. That was just 1 year, though. How about 9 years later? This is the largest, longest follow-up study I could find. At least some of the fast-induced weight losses were maintained a year later by the great majority. A year later, 90% remained lighter than they started out. But then 2 years later, 3 years, 4 years, 7 years, and by 9 years later, that number dropped to fewer than 1 in 10. By then, almost everyone had regained the weight they had initially fasted away. Many patients reported they thought the temporary loss was worth it, though. As a group, they lost an average about 60 pounds. They described improved health and quality of life, claiming re-employment was facilitated and earnings increased during that period of time. But the fasting didn't appear to result in any permanent change in eating habits for the vast majority. The small minority for which fasting led to sustainable weight loss all admit to a radical change in previous eating habits. Fasting only works long-term if it can act as a jumpstart to a healthier diet. In a retrospective long-term comparison of weight reduction after an inpatient stay at a naturopathic center, those who were fasted lost more weight at the time, but at around 7 years were back to the same weight. No surprise, since they reported returning to the same diet they were on before. Those who were instead placed on a healthier, more whole-food plant-based diet were more likely to make persistent changes in their diet, and 7 years later were lighter than when they started. Why can't you have it both ways, though? You could use fasting to kickstart a big drop and then start a healthier diet. The problem is that big drop is largely illusory. Fasting for a week or two can cause more weight loss than calorie restriction, but paradoxically it may actually lead to less loss of body fat. Wait, how can eating fewer calories lead to less fat loss? Because during fasting, your body starts cannibalizing itself and burning more of your own protein for fuel. Emperor penguins, elephant seals, and hibernating bears can survive just burning fat without dipping into their muscles, but our voracious big brains appear to need at least a trickle of blood sugar, and if we're not eating any carbohydrates, our body is forced to start turning our protein into sugar to burn. Even just a few grams of carbs, like people who add honey to their water when they fast, can cut protein loss up to 50%. What about adding exercise to prevent loss of lean tissues during a fast? It may make it worse. At rest, most of your heart and muscle energy needs can be met with fat. But if you start exercising, they start grabbing some of the blood sugar meant for your brain, and your body may have to break down even more protein. Less than half of the weight loss during the first few weeks of fasting ends up coming from your fat stores. So even if you double your daily weight loss on a fast, you may actually be losing less body fat. An NIH-funded study placed obese individuals on an 800-calorie-a-day diet for 2 weeks, and they steadily lost about a half a pound of body fat a day. Then they switched them to about 2 weeks of 0 calories, and they started losing more protein and water, but on average only lost a few ounces of fat a day. When they were subsequently switched back to the initial 800 calories a day for a week, they rapidly replaced the protein in water, and so the scale registered their weight going up. But their body fat loss accelerated back to the approximate half-pound a day. The scale made it look as though they were doing better when they were completely fasting, but the reality is that they were doing worse. So during the 5-week experiment, they would have lost even more body fat sticking to their calorie-restricted diet than completely stopping eating in the middle. They would have lost more body fat eating more calories. Fasting for a week or two can interfere with the loss of body fat rather than accelerate it. Although fasting for a week or two can actually interfere with the loss of body fat, eventually, after the 3rd week of fasting, fat loss starts to overtake the loss of lean body mass in obese individuals. But is it safe to go that long without food? Proponents speak of fasting as a cleansing process, but some of what you're purging from your body are essential vitamins and minerals. Heavy enough people can go up to 382 days without calories, but no one can go even a fraction of that long without vitamins. Scurvy, for example, is diagnosable within as few as 4 weeks without any vitamin C. Beriberi, thiamine, or vitamin B1 deficiency, may start out even earlier in fasting patients, and once manifest can result in brain damage within days, which can eventually become irreversible. Even though fasting patients report problems such as nausea and indigestion taking supplements, all the months-long fasting cases I've mentioned in the last few videos were given daily multivitamins and mineral supplementation as necessary. Without supplementation, hunger strikers and those undergoing prolonged fast for therapeutic or religious purposes, like the Baptist pastor hoping to enhance his spiritual powers for exorcism, have ended up paralyzed, comatose, or worse. Nutrient deficiencies aren't the only risk. Reading about all the successful reports of massive weight loss from prolonged fasting in the medical literature, one doctor decided to give it a try with his patients. Of the first dozen he tried it on, though, 2 died. Now, in retrospect, both of the 2 patients that died started out with heart failure and were on diuretics. Fasting itself produces a pronounced diuresis, meaning loss of water and electrolytes through the urine, and so was the combination of fasting on top of the water pills that likely depleted their potassium and triggered their fatal heart rhythms. The doctor went out of his way to point out that both of those who died started out in severe heart failure, and both had improved greatly while undergoing starvation therapy. Small consolation, since they were both dead within a matter of weeks. Not all therapeutic fasting fatalities were complicated by concurrent medication use. At first, he did very well and experienced the usual euphoria. His electrolytes remained fine, but in the middle of the 3rd week he suddenly collapsed and died. This line of treatment is certainly tempting because it does produce weight loss, and the patient feels so much better, but the whole killing people thing must make it a very suspect line of management. Contrary to the popular notion that the heart muscle is specially spared during fasting, the heart appears to experience similar muscle wasting. This was noted in the victims of the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II in a remarkable series of detailed studies carried out by the ghetto physicians themselves before they themselves succumbed. In a case entitled Gross Fragmentation of Cardiac Fiber After Therapeutic Starvation for Obesity, a 20-year-old woman successfully achieved her ideal body weight after losing 128 pounds fasting for 30 weeks. After a breakfast of 1 egg, she had a heart attack and died. On autopsy, the muscle fibers in her heart showed evidence of widespread disintegration. The pathologist suggested that fasting regimens should no longer be recommended as a safe means of weight reduction. Breaking the fast appears to be the most dangerous part. After World War II, as many as 1 out of 5 starved Japanese prisoners of war tragically died following liberation. Now known as refeeding syndrome, Multi-organ system failure can result from resuming a regular diet too quickly. See, there are critical nutrients such as thiamine and phosphorus that are used to metabolize food. So in the critical refeeding window, if too much food is taken before these nutrients can be replenished, demand may exceed supply, and whatever residual stores you still carry can be driven down even further, with potentially fatal consequences. That's why rescue workers are taught to always give thiamine before food to victims who had been trapped or otherwise unable to eat. Thiamine is responsible for the yellow color of banana bags, a term you might have heard used on medical dramas, used to describe an IV fluid concoction often given to malnourished alcoholics to prevent a similar reaction. Anyone with negligible food intake for more than 5 days may be at risk for developing refeeding problems. Medically supervised fasting has gotten much safer now that there are proper refeeding protocols. We know what warning signs to look for, and we now know who shouldn't be fasting in the first place, such as those with advanced liver, kidney failure, porphyria, uncontrolled hyperthyroidism, and pregnant and breastfeeding women. The most comprehensive safety analysis of medically supervised water-only fasting was recently published out of the True North Health Center in California. Out of 768 visits to their facility for fasts up to 41 days, were there any adverse events? Yes, 5,961 of them, but most were mild, known reactions to fasting, such as fatigue, nausea, insomnia, headache, dizziness, upset stomach, back pain. They report only 2 serious events and no fatalities. Fasting longer than 24 hours, and particularly 3 or more days, should only be done under the supervision of a physician, and preferably in a live-in clinic. In other words, don't try this at home. This is not just legalistic mumbo-jumbo. For example, normally, your kidneys dive into sodium conservation mode during fasting. But should that response break down, you could rapidly develop an electrolyte abnormality that may only manifest with nonspecific symptoms like fatigue or dizziness, which could easily be dismissed until it's too late. The risks of any therapy must be premised on the severity of the disease. The consequences of obesity are considered so serious that effective therapies could have considerable acceptable toxicity. For example, many consider major surgery for obesity to be a justifiable risk. But the key word is effective. Therapeutic fasting for obesity has been largely abandoned by the medical community, not only because of its uncertain safety profile, but its questionable short-term and long-term efficacy. Remember, for a fast that only lasts a week or 2, you might be able to lose as much body fat or even more on a low-calorie diet than a no-calorie diet. Even as proponents of cannabis legalization contend that marijuana is a harmless natural substance that improves quality of life, a growing body of evidence links it in a small but significant number of users to the induction or aggravation of psychosis. Psychotic disorders are arguably the most serious of mental illnesses, the best known being schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is an illness characterized by delusions, hallucinations, odd behavior, and is among the top 10 leading causes of disability in the United States, affecting approximately 1% of the general population. Can cannabis cause it? Nearly 2,000 studies have been published on this topic over the last half-century, and we hear about the pro-psychotic effects, but how clear is that link? Well, population studies have consistently demonstrated a strong dose-dependent association between cannabis use and the risk of psychotic disorders. This is what they mean by a dose response. Studies showing that the more cannabis people used, the more likely they were to be psychotic. But that doesn't mean cannabis is the cause. It could just be a correlation, or even a consequence of the disease. Yeah, the link between cannabis and psychosis is well established, but maybe that's just because patients with mental health problems self-medicate with cannabis to relieve their distress. But there isn't just a link between cannabis and psychosis in snapshot-in-time cross-sectional studies, but in cohort studies as well, where people are followed over time, and so you can see the cannabis use often precedes the psychosis, and not the other way around. Now, it goes without saying that the vast majority of people who use cannabis do not develop schizophrenia, and many schizophrenics have never used cannabis, but overall these studies are considered to be strong enough evidence to warrant a public health warning. There is another potential explanation, though. Even though cannabis use precedes schizophrenia, maybe whatever genes drive schizophrenia also just make it more likely you start smoking pot? The biggest strike against the cannabis-schizophrenia link are country-by-country ecological studies that don't seem to show more disease in areas where there's more use, and overall, schizophrenia rates seem to have remained stable or even gone down worldwide since the 60s, even though there's been a big bump in cannabis use since then. I mean, if about 10% of schizophrenia cases are attributable to marijuana use, and there's been a fourfold increase in use, why hasn't there been a 40% increase in the prevalence of schizophrenia? The problem with that argument is that there's apparently little reliable evidence on the true trends in the incidence of schizophrenia. Or maybe it's more of a potency issue rather than just cannabis in general. The bottom line is you just don't know when you put it to the test. You can't just randomize kids to cannabis, but in a way Mother Nature set up a natural experiment for us. There are genes that kids randomly get that can increase their likelihood of smoking pot. Do those kids then go on to have a higher risk of schizophrenia? Yes, supporting all those population studies that suggest cannabis plays a cause and effect role in the development of schizophrenia. OK, but by how much? Let's break it down. Even if cannabis use doubles risk, that would only mean going from like a 7 in 1,000 chance of going crazy to like 14 in 1,000. So like a 1 in 140 chance to a 1 in 70 chance. Now, if it runs in your family, that's different, and that doubling could mean going from like 1 in 10 to 1 in 5. But on a population scale, it could take thousands of users quitting to prevent a single case of schizophrenia. So from a public health standpoint, addiction is a far more common problem, and people are probably 9 times more likely to become addicted to marijuana, even though that itself is relatively rare, than to develop psychosis in their lifetime. Rather than cutting calories day in and day out, what if you instead just ate as much as you wanted every other day? Or for only a few hours a day, or fasted 2 days a week, or 5 days a month. These are all examples of intermittent fasting regimens. That may even be the way we were built. 3 meals a day may be a relatively novel behavior for our species. For millennia, our ancestors may have only consumed only 1 large meal a day, or went several days at a time without food. Intermittent fasting is often presented as a means of stressing your body in a good way. There's a concept in biology called hormesis, which can be thought of as the that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger principle. Exercise is the classic example where you put stress on your heart and muscles, and as long as there's sufficient recovery time, you are all the healthier for it. Is that the case with intermittent fasting? Mark Twain thought it was. A little starvation can do more for the average sick man than can the best medicines and the best doctors. Not just a restricted diet, but total abstention from food for 1 or 2 days. But Twain also said, many a small thing has been made large by the right kind of advertising. Is the craze over intermittent fasting just hype? Many diet fads have their roots in legitimate science, but over time, facts can get distorted, benefits exaggerated, and risks downplayed. In other words, science takes a backseat to marketing. At the same time, you don't want to lose out on any potential benefit by dismissing something out of hand based on the absurdist claims of overzealous promoters. You don't want to throw the baby out with the baby fat. Religious fasting is the most studied form of intermittent fasting, specifically Ramadan, a month-long period in which devout Muslims abstain from food and drink from sunrise to sunset. The effects are complicated by a change in sleeping patterns and also thirst. The same dehydration issues arises with Yom Kippur, when observant Jews stop eating and drinking for about 25 hours. The most studied form of intermittent fasting that deals only with food restriction is alternate day fasting, which involves eating every other day, alternating with days consuming little or no calories. At rest, we burn about a 50-50 mix of carbs and fat, but we usually run out of our glycogen, or our carbohydrate stores, within 12 and 36 hours of stopping eating. At that point, our body has to shift to rely more on our fat stores. This metabolic switch may help explain why the greatest rate of breakdown and burning of fat over a 3-day fast happens between the hours of 18 and 24 of the 72-hour period. The hope is to reap some of the benefits of taking a break from eating without the risks of prolonged fasting. One of the potential benefits of alternate day fasting over chronic calorie restriction is that you get regular breaks from feeling constant hunger. But might people become so famished on their fasting day that they turn the next into a feasting day and overeat? If you ate more than twice as much as you normally would, then that presumably would defeat the whole point of alternate day fasting. Mice fed every other day don't lose weight. They just eat roughly twice as much in one day that non-fasted mice would regularly eat in 2. That is not, however, what happens in people. Randomized to fast from 8 p.m. the night before to 8 a.m. the next day, fasting for 36 hours only led to people eating an average of 20% more the day after they broke the fast, compared to a control group that didn't fast at all. That would leave them with a large calorie deficit, equivalent to a daily calorie restriction of nearly 1,000 calories a day. This particular study involved lean men and women, but similar results have been found amongst overweight or obese subjects, typically only about a 10 to 25% compensatory increase in calorie intake over baseline on non-fasting days. And this seems to be the case whether the fasting day was a true zero-calorie fast or a few hundred-calorie so-called modified fast day, which may lead to better compliance. Some studies found study subjects appeared to eat no more or even less on days after a day-long mini-fast. Even within studies, great variability is reported. In a 24-hour fasting study where folks ate an early dinner and then had a late dinner the next day after skipping breakfast and lunch, the degree of compensation at the second dinner ranged from 7% to 110%. This means some got so hungry by the time supper rolled around that they ate more than 24 hours worth of calories in a single meal. The researchers suggested that perhaps people first try test fasts to see how much their hunger and subsequent intake ramps up before considering an intermittent fasting regimen. Hunger levels can change over time, though, dissipating as your body habituates to the new normal. In an 8-week study in which obese subjects were restricted to about 500 calories every other day, after approximately 2 weeks, they reportedly started feeling very little hunger on their slashed calorie days. This no doubt helped them lose about a dozen pounds on average over the duration of the study, but there was no control group with which to compare. A similar study with a control group found a similar amount of weight loss, about 10 pounds over 12 weeks in a group of normal weight, meaning overweight on average, individuals. For these modified regimens, where people are getting prescribed 500 calories on their quote-unquote fasting days, researchers found that from a weight loss perspective, it did not appear to matter whether those calories are divided up throughout the day or eaten in a single meal. Instead of prescribing a set number of calories on fasting days, which many people find difficult to calculate outside of a study setting, a pair of Iranian researchers instead came upon a brilliant idea of unlimited above-ground vegetables. Starchy root vegetables are relatively calorie-dense compared to other vegetables, but vegetables that grow above the ground, including stem vegetables like celery and rhubarb, flowering vegetables like cauliflower, leafy vegetables like, well, leafy vegetables, and then all the fruits we tend to think of as vegetables like tomatoes, peppers, okra, eggplant, string beans, summer squash, zucchini. So instead of just prescribing a certain number of calories for their fasting days, subjects alternated between their regular diet and helping themselves every other day to an all-you-can-eat above-ground vegetable feast, along with naturally non-caloric beverages like green tea or black coffee. After 8 weeks, subjects lost an average of 13 pounds and 2 inches off their waist. The same variability discovered for calorie compensation has also been found for weight loss, though. In a 12-month trial in which subjects were instructed to eat only 1/4 of their calorie needs every other day, weight changes varied from a loss of about 37 pounds to a gain of about 8 pounds. The biggest factor differentiating the low weight loss group from the high weight loss group appeared to be not how much they feasted on their regular diet days, but how much they were able to comply on their fast days with the calorie restriction. Overall, 10 out of 10 alternate day fasting studies showed significant reductions in body fat. Small short-term studies show about a 4 to 8% drop in body weight after 3 to 12 weeks. How does that compare with continuous calorie restriction? 0-calorie alternate day fasting was compared head-to-head to a daily 400-calorie restriction for 8 weeks. Both groups lost the same amount of weight, about 17 pounds, and in the follow-up check-in 6 months later, after the trial ended, both groups had maintained a similar degree of weight loss, still both down about a dozen pounds. The hope that intermittent fasting would somehow avoid the metabolic adaptations that slow weight loss or improve compliance don't seem to have materialized. The same compensatory reactions in terms of increased appetite and a slower metabolism plague both continuous and intermittent caloric restriction, and the largest, longest trial of alternate day fasting found that may even be less sustainable than more traditional approaches. By the end of the year, the dropout rate of the alternate day fasting group was 38%, compared to 29% in the continuous calorie restriction group. Though to date, alternate day fasting regimens haven't been shown to produce superior weight loss, for the individuals that may prefer this pattern of calorie restriction, are there any downsides? We'll find out next. Are there any downsides to fasting every other day? For example, might going all day without eating impair your ability to think clearly? Surprisingly, the results appear to be equivocal. Some studies show no measurable effects, and the ones that do fail to agree on which cognitive domains are affected. Might the fasting-feasting cycles cause eating disorder-type behavior, like binging? So far, no harmful psychological effects have been found. In fact, there may actually be some benefit, though the studies that have put it to the test specifically excluded those with a documented history of eating disorders for whom the effects may differ. What about bone health? No change in bone mineral density was noted after 6 months of alternate day fasting, despite about 16 pounds of weight loss, which would typically result in a dip in bone mass. There were no skeletal changes noted in the control group either, however, that lost a similar amount of weight using continuous calorie restriction. The researchers suggest that this is because both groups tend to be more physically active than the average obese individuals by 1,000 or 2,000 steps a day. Proponents of intermittent fasting suggest it can better protect lean body mass, but most of the intermittent trials have employed less accurate methods of body composition analysis, whereas the majority of continuous calorie restriction trials used vastly more accurate technologies. So to date, it's not clear if there's a difference in lean mass preservation. Improvements in blood pressure and triglycerides have been noted on intermittent fasting regimens, though this is presumed to be due to the reduction in body fat, since the effect appears to be weight loss dependent. Alternate day fasting can improve artery function too, though it does depend on what you're eating on your non-fasting day. Randomized to an alternate day diet high in saturated fat, artery function worsened despite a 15-pound weight loss, whereas it improved as expected in the lower fat group. The decline in artery function was presumed to be because of the pro-inflammatory nature of saturated fat. A concern has been raised about the effects of alternate day fasting on cholesterol. After 24 hours without food, LDL cholesterol may temporarily bump up, but this is presumably just because so much fat is being released into the system by the fast. An immediate negative effect on carbohydrate tolerance may stem from the same phenomenon, the repeated elevations of free fat floating around in your bloodstream. After a few weeks, though, LDL levels start to drop as the weight comes off. However, results from the largest and longest trial of alternate day fasting have given me pause. 100 obese men and women were randomized into one of 3 groups: alternate day modified fasting, 25% of their baseline calories on fasting days, 125% calories on eating days. continuous daily calorie restriction, 75% of baseline, or a control group instructed to maintain their regular diet. So, for those going into the trial eating 2,000 calories a day, in the control group, they would have continued to eat 2,000 calories a day. The calorie restriction group would have started at 1,500 a day every day, and the intermittent restriction group would alternate between 500 calories a day and 2,500 calories a day. With the same overall average prescribed calorie cutting in both weight loss groups, they both lost about the same amount of weight. But surprisingly, the cholesterol effects were different. In the continuous calorie restriction group, the LDL dropped as expected compared to the control group as the pounds came off. But in the alternate day modified fasting group, they didn't. At the end of the year, the LDL cholesterol in the intermittent fasting group ended up 10% higher than the constant calorie restriction group, despite the exact same loss of body fat. Given that LDL cholesterol is a prime causal risk factor for our #1 killer, heart disease, or even the prime risk factor for our #1 killer, this strikes a significant blow against alternate-day fasting. If you do want to try it anyway, I would advise you to have your cholesterol monitored to make sure it comes down with your weight. If you're diabetic, it's critical you talk to your physician about medication adjustment for any changes in diet, including fasting, of any duration. Even with proactive medication reduction, advice to immediately break the fast should sugars drop too low, and weekly medical supervision, type 2 diabetics fasting even just 2 days a week were twice as likely to suffer from hypoglycemic episodes compared to the unfasted control group. We still don't know the best way to tweak blood sugar meds to prevent blood sugars dropping too low on fasting days. Even just fasting for a day can significantly slow the clearance of some drugs, like the blood-thinning drug Coumadin, or increase the clearance of others, like caffeine. Fasting for 36 hours can cut your caffeine buzz by 20%. So, consultation with your medical professional before fasting is an especially good idea for anyone on any kind of medication. Is it true that alternate-day calorie restriction prolongs life? Doctors have anecdotally attributed improvements in a variety of disease states to alternate-day fasting, including asthma, seasonal allergies, autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, infectious diseases like toenail fungus, periodontal disease, and viral upper respiratory tract infections, neurological conditions like Tourette syndrome and Meniere's disease, atrial fibrillation, and menopause-related hot flashes. The actual effect on chronic disease, however, remains unclear. Alternate-day fasting has been put to the test for asthma in overweight adults. Asthma-related symptoms and control significantly improved, as did their quality of life, including objective measurements of lung function and inflammation, significant improvements in peak airflow, significant improvements in mood and energy, but their weight improved too, about a 19-pound drop in 8 weeks, so it's hard to tease out effects specific to the fasting beyond the benefits we might expect from weight loss by any means. For the most remarkable study on alternate-day fasting, you have to go back more than a half-century. The 2017 cholesterol findings were the most concerning data I could find on alternate-day fasting. The most enticing was published in Spain 61 years earlier in 1956. The title of the study translates as The Hunger Diet on Alternate Days in the Nutrition of the Aged. Inspired by the data being published on life extension with calorie restriction on lab rats, researchers split 120 residents of an old-age home in Madrid into 2 groups. 60 residents continued to eat their regular diet, and the other 60 were put on an alternate-day modified fast. On the odd days of the month, they ate a 2,300-calorie regular diet, and on the even days were given only a pound of fresh fruit and a liter of milk, estimated to add up to about 900 calories. This continued for 3 years. So what happened? Over the duration of the study, 13 died in the control group, compared to only 6 in the intermittent fasting group. But those numbers were too small to be statistically significant. What was highly significant was the number of days spent hospitalized. Residents in the control group spent a total of 219 days in the infirmary, whereas the alternate-day fasting group only chalked up 123 days. This is held up as solid evidence that alternate-day fasting may improve one's health span and potentially even one's lifespan. But a few caveats must be considered. It's not clear how the residents were allocated to their respective groups. If instead of being randomized, healthier individuals were inadvertently placed in the intermittent fasting group, that could skew the results in their favor. Also, it appears that the director of the study was also in charge of medical decisions at the home. In that role, he could have unconsciously been biased towards hospitalizing more folks in the control group. Given the progress that has been made regulating human experimentation, it's hard to imagine such a trial being run today, and so we may actually never know if such impressive findings can be replicated. What about instead of eating every other day, you ate 5 days a week and fasted the other 2? The available data is actually similar to that of alternate-day fasting. About a dozen pounds of weight loss was reported in overweight men and women over a 6-month period, with no difference found between those on the 5-2 intermittent fasting regimen and those on a continuous 500 calories a day restriction. The largest trial to date found an 18-pound weight loss within 6 months in the 5-2 group, not significantly different from the 20 pounds lost in the continuous calorie restriction group. Weight maintenance over subsequent 6 months was also found to be no different. Though feelings of hunger may be more pronounced on the 5-2 pattern than an equivalent level of daily calorie cutting, it does not seem to lead to overeating on the non-fasting days. One might expect going 2 days without food might negatively impact mood, but no such adverse impact was noted for those fully fasting on 0 calories or sticking to just 2 packets of oatmeal on each of the fasting days, which provide about 500 calories a day. Like alternate-day fasting, the 5-2 fasting pattern appeared to have inconsistent effects on cognition and lean mass preservation, and failed to live up to the popular notion that intermittent fasting would prove to be easier to adhere to than daily calorie restriction. In fact, fewer subjects on the 5-2 pattern expressed interest in continuing the diet after the study was over compared to the continuous restriction control group, attributed to quality of life issues, citing headaches, lack of energy, and the difficulty of fitting the fasting days into their weekly routine. However, there is yet to be a single 5-2 study showing elevated LDL cholesterol compared to continuous calorie restriction at 6 months or a year, offering a potential advantage over alternate-day regimens. Instead of 5-2, what about 25-5, spending 5 days a month on a fasting-mimicking diet? Longevity researcher Valter Longo designed a 5-day meal plan to try to simulate the metabolic effects of fasting by being low in protein, sugars, and calories, with 0 animal protein or animal fat. By making it plant-based, he was hoping to lower the level of the cancer-promoting growth hormone IGF-1, which he indeed accomplished, along with a drop in markers of inflammation after 3 cycles of his 5 days a month program. 100 men and women were randomized to consume his fasting-mimicking diet for 5 consecutive days per month, or to maintain their regular diet the whole time. After 3 months, the FMD group, the fasting-mimicking diet group, was down about 6 pounds compared to control, with significant drops in body fat and waist circumference accompanied by a drop in blood pressures. Those who were the worst off accrued the most dramatic benefits. What's even crazier is that 3 further months after completion, some of the benefit appeared to persist, suggesting the effects may last for several months. It's unclear, though, if those randomized to the fasting-mimicking diet group used it as an opportunity to make positive lifestyle changes that helped maintain some of the weight loss. Dr. Longo created a company to commercially market his meal plan, but to his credit, says he donates 100% of the profits he receives from it to charity. The whole diet appears to mostly just be a few dehydrated soup mixes, herbal teas like hibiscus and chamomile, kale chips, nut-based energy bars, an algae-based DHA supplement, and a multivitamin dusted with vegetable powder. So I figure, why spend $50 a day on a few processed snacks when you could instead eat a few hundred calories a day of real vegetables? Someone walks into the ER with intractable hiccups. One of the questions the emergency room physician should ask is, have you been eating starfruit? In my video cautioning about oxalate-rich foods, I talked about starfruit nephrotoxicity, kidney toxicity. Excessive consumption of starfruit has been associated with the development of oxalate kidney damage. Less than a cup of starfruit juice, or 3 whole fruits, they're not that big, can result in acute starfruit nephrotoxicity. Ingestion of even modest quantities of starfruits can produce kidney problems. So it's essential to educate the public to avoid consuming starfruit, especially on an empty stomach or in a dehydrated state, to prevent starfruit nephrotoxicity. But what about the neurotoxicity? We've known for more than a quarter century now about the neurotoxic effects, but few seem to be familiar with the syndrome. It starts most commonly with hiccups, but then can rapidly worsen, especially in those with compromised kidney function to start out with. Why? Because the fruit contains a powerful neurotoxin that can accumulate in the blood, cross the blood-brain barrier, and eventually cause irreversible brain damage. The toxin itself, named caramboxin, is normally excreted by the kidneys, and so is especially toxic to those with renal insufficiency, compromised kidney function, so much so that for those with severe chronic kidney disease, a single starfruit can put someone in seizures within 3 hours, a coma, and then death within 3 days. In a series of about 100 cases of toxicity, consumption ranged between just a half a starfruit up to 50, with an average of about 4. But most of those had some sort of pre-existing kidney disease. The average number of starfruits eaten by the normal kidney function group before their toxic dose was more like 15. So people with normal kidney function may be more likely to suffer from kidney damage than brain damage, which starts at down around about 4 starfruit. The bottom line is that those with chronic kidney disease should avoid starfruit to avoid severe intoxication. In Brazil, where the fruit is popular, there are actually laws to alert people about the risks. Because of the neurotoxin, starfruit should be prohibited for patients with chronic kidney disease, and even those with normal kidney function may want to avoid the fruit. Just something to think about before you reach for the stars. The reason many blood tests are taken before eating after an overnight fast is that meals can tip our system out of balance, bumping up certain biomarkers for disease such as blood sugars, insulin, cholesterol, and triglycerides. Yet fewer than 1 in 10 Americans may even make it 12 hours without eating. As evolutionarily unnatural eating 3 meals a day is, most of us are eating even more than that. One study using a smartphone app to record more than 25,000 eating events found that people tended to eat about every 3 hours over an average span of about 15 hours a day. Might it be beneficial to give our bodies a bigger break? Time-restricted feeding is defined as fasting for periods of at least 12 hours, but less than 24 hours. This involves trying to confine calorie intake to a set window of time, typically 3 to 4 hours, 7 to 9 hours, or 10 to 12 hours a day, resulting in a daily fast lasting 12 to 21 hours. When mice are restricted to a daily feeding window, they gain less weight even when fed the exact same amount. Rodents have such high metabolisms, though, that a single day of fasting can starve away as much as 15% of their lean body mass. This makes it difficult to extrapolate from mouse models. You don't know what happens in humans until you put it to the test. The dropout rates in time-restricted feeding trials certainly appear lower than most prolonged forms of intermittent fasting, suggesting it's more easily tolerable, but does it work? If you have people even just stop eating between 7 p.m. and 6 a.m. for 2 weeks, they lose about a pound each week compared to no time restriction. Note, no additional instructions or recommendations were given on the amount or type of food consumed, no gadgets, calorie counting, or record keeping. They were just told to limit their food intake to the hours of 6 a.m. through 7 p.m., a simple intervention, easy to understand and implement. The next logical step was to try putting it to the test for months instead of just weeks. Obese men and women were asked to restrict eating to an 8-hour window between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. 12 weeks later, they'd lost 7 pounds. This deceptively simple intervention may be operating from a number of different angles. People tend to eat more food later in the day, and higher fat foods later in the day. By eliminating eating in the late evening hours, one removes prime-time snacking on the couch, a high-risk time for overeating. And indeed, during the No Eating After 7 p.m. study, the subjects were inadvertently eating about 250 fewer calories a day. Then there are also the chronobiological benefits of avoiding late-night eating. I'm going to do a whole series of videos about the role our circadian rhythms have in the obesity epidemic, how the timing of meals can be critical, and how we can match meal timing to our body clocks. Just to give you a taste, the exact same number of calories at dinner is significantly more fattening than the same number of calories eaten at breakfast. Calories in the morning cause less weight gain than the same calories given in the evening. A diet with a bigger breakfast causes more weight loss than the same exact diet with a bigger dinner. Nighttime snacks are more fattening than the same snacks in the daytime. Thanks to our circadian rhythms, metabolic slowing, hunger, carbohydrate intolerance, triglycerides, and a propensity for weight gain are all things that go bump in the night. What about the fasting component of the time-restricted feeding? There's already the double benefit of fewer calories and avoiding nighttime eating. Does the fact that you're fasting for 11 or 16 hours a day play any role, considering the average person may only make it about 9 hours a day without eating? How would you design an experiment to test that? What if you randomized people into two groups and forced both groups to eat the same number of calories a day, and both to eat late into the evening, but with one group fasting even longer, 20 hours? That's exactly what researchers at the USDA and National Institute of Aging did. Men and women were randomized to eat 3 meals a day, or to fit all those same calories into a 4-hour window between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m., and fast the rest of the day. If the weight loss benefits from the other two time-restricted feeding studies was due to the passive calorie restriction or avoidance of late-night eating, then presumably both these groups should end up the same, because they're both eating the same amount and they're both eating late. But that's not what happened. After 8 weeks, the time-restricted feeding group ended up with nearly 5 pounds less body fat, about the same number of calories, but they lost more weight. A similar study with an 8-hour window resulted in 3 pounds more fat loss. So there does seem to be something to giving your body daily breaks from eating around the clock. Because that 4-hour window was at night, though, they suffered the chronobiological consequences, significant elevations in blood pressures and cholesterol levels despite the weight loss. The best of both worlds was demonstrated in 2018, early time-restricted feeding, eating within a narrow window earlier in the day, which we'll cover next. Time-restricted feeding, where you try to squeeze the same amount of eating into a narrow evening window, has benefits compared to eating in the evening and earlier in the day, but also has adverse effects because you're eating so much so late. The best of both worlds was demonstrated in 2018, time-restricted feeding into a narrow window earlier in the day. Individuals randomized to eat the same food, but just in an 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. eating window, experienced a drop in blood pressures, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance, even when all the study subjects were maintained at the same weight. Same food, same weight, but with different results. The drops in blood pressures were extraordinary, from 123/82 down to 112/72 in 5 weeks, comparable to the effectiveness of potent blood pressure drugs. The longest study to date on time-restricted feeding only lasted 16 weeks, a pilot study with no control group that only involved 8 people, but the results are still worth noting. Overweight individuals who, like most of us, were eating more than 14 hours a day were instructed to stick to a consistent 10 to 12-hour feeding window of their own choosing. On average, they were able to successfully reduce their daily eating duration by about 4.5 hours, and within 16 weeks they had lost 7 pounds. They also reported feeling more energetic and sleeping better. This may help explain why all participants voluntarily expressed their interest in continuing the time-restricted feeding on their own, even after the study ended. You don't often see that after weight loss studies. Even more remarkable, 8 months later, they retained their weight loss and improved energy and sleep. At the 1-year point, maintained their boosted energy and sleep, and kept the weight off, all from one of the simplest of interventions, just telling people to stick to a consistent 10 to 12-hour feeding window of their own choosing. How did it work? Even though they weren't told to change nutrition quality or quantity, they appeared to unintentionally eat hundreds of fewer calories a day. With self-selected time frames, you wouldn't necessarily think to expect circadian benefits, but because subjects were asked to keep the eating window consistent throughout the week, metabolic jet lag could be minimized. The thinking is that because people tend to start their days later on weekends, that's disrupting their circadian rhythm. And indeed, it's like they flew a few time zones west on Friday evening and flew back east on Monday morning. So some of the metabolic advantage may actually be due to maintaining a more regular eating schedule. Early or midday time-restricted feeding may have other benefits as well. Prolonged nightly fasting with reduced evening food intake has been associated with lower levels of inflammation and better blood sugar control, both of which might be expected to lower the risk of diseases such as breast cancer. So, data was collected on thousands of breast cancer survivors to see if nightly fasting duration made a difference. Those who couldn't go more than 13 hours every night without eating had a 36% higher risk of cancer recurrence. These findings have led to the suggestion that efforts to avoid eating after 8 p.m. and fast for 13 hours or more overnight may be a beneficial consideration for those patients looking to decrease cancer risk and recurrence, though we'd need a randomized controlled trial to know for sure. Early time-restricted feeding may even play a role in the health of perhaps the longest-living population in the world, the Seventh-day Adventist Blue Zone in California. Slim, vegetarian, nut-eating, exercising, non-smoking Adventists live about a decade longer than the general population. Their greater life expectancy has been ascribed to these healthy lifestyle behaviors, but there's one lesser-known component that also may be playing a role. Historically, eating 2 large meals a day, breakfast and lunch, with a prolonged overnight fast was a part of Adventist teachings. Today, only about 1 in 10 Adventists surveyed were eating just 2 meals a day, but most, over 60%, reported breakfast or lunch was their largest meal of the day. Though this is yet to be studied with respect to longevity, front-loading one's calories earlier in the day with a prolonged nightly fast has been associated with significant weight loss over time, leading the researchers to conclude that eating breakfast and lunch 5 to 6 hours apart and making the overnight fast last 18 to 19 hours may be a useful practical strategy for weight control. The wait may be worth the wait. Previously, I've explored the potent antihypertensive effect of dietary flaxseed in hypertensive patients. This was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial where they disguised ground flaxseed in baked goods versus flax-free placebo muffins, and got an extraordinary drop in high blood pressures. As you can imagine, the flaxseed industry was overjoyed, praising the impressive findings, as was I. After all, high blood pressure is the single largest risk factor for death on the planet Earth. Yes, we give people medications, lots and lots of medications, but most people don't take them, as in 9 out of 10 people take less than 80% of the prescribed blood pressure pills, just 8%. It's not difficult to understand why. Patients are asked to follow an inconvenient, potentially costly regimen, which will likely have detrimental effect on their health-related quality of life, to treat a mostly asymptomatic condition, so they may feel worse instead of better due to the side effects. The answer, then, is to give them more drugs to counteract the effects of the first drugs, like giving men Viagra to counter the erectile dysfunction caused by their blood pressure pills. How about using a dietary strategy instead, especially if it can just be as effective? And indeed, the drop in blood pressures they got in the flaxseed study was greater than the average decrease observed with the standard dose of antihypertensive drugs. And flax seeds are cheaper, too, compared to even single medications, and most patients are on multiple drugs, and has good side effects beyond their antihypertensive actions, but not all good. Taking tablespoons of flaxseed a day is a lot of fiber for people who've been living off of cheeseburgers and milkshakes their whole lives, and it can take a little while for your gut bacteria to adjust to the new bounty. So people who start out with low-fiber diets may want to take it slow at first. Not all studies have shown significant blood pressure-lowering effects. There have been over a dozen trials by now, involving more than 1,000 subjects, and though yes, put them all together, and overall there were significant reductions in both systolic and diastolic blood pressures, the upper and lower numbers, following supplementation with various flaxseed products. None were as dramatic as that 6-month trial. The longer trials tended to show better results, and some of the trials just used flaxseed oil or some kind of flaxseed extract. And the thought is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Each of the components of interest within flaxseed, the omega-3s, the cancer-fighting lignans, all the soluble fiber and plant proteins, all contribute toward the blood pressure reduction. OK, but how? Why? Right? What's the mechanism? Some common blood pressure medications like Norvasc or Procardia work by reducing the ability of the heart to contract, or slowing the heart down. And so it's possible that's how flax seeds work too. But no, dietary flaxseed reduces blood pressure without cardiac involvement, but rather through changes in plasma oxylipins. What are oxylipins? Oxylipins are a group of fatty acid metabolites involved in inflammation, and as a result have been implicated in many pro-inflammatory conditions, including cardiovascular disease and aging. The best characterized oxylipins in relation to cardiovascular disease are derived from the long-chain omega-6 fatty acids known as arachidonic acid, found preformed in animal products, particularly chicken and eggs, and can be made inside the body from junky omega-6 rich oils such as cottonseed oil. But elevated levels of pro-inflammatory oxylipins in older subjects are normalized by flaxseed consumption. See, that's how he thinks flaxseed consumption reduces blood pressure in patients with hypertension, by inhibiting the enzyme that makes these pro-inflammatory oxylipins. I'll spare you from the acronym overload, but basically, eating flax seeds inhibits the activity of the enzyme that makes these pro-inflammatory oxylipins, called leukotoxin diols, which in turn may lower blood pressure. Identifying the molecular mechanisms adds confidence to the antihypertensive actions of dietary flaxseed, but that's not all oxylipins do. Oxylipins may play a role in the aging process, but we may be able to beneficially disrupt these biological changes associated with inflammation and aging with nutritional intervention like flaxseed. Older adults around age 50 have higher levels of these arachidonic acid-derived oxylipins compared to younger adults around age 20. These elevated concentrations of pro-inflammatory oxylipins in the older age group may help explain the higher levels of inflammation in older versus younger individuals. I mean, as we get older, right, we're more likely to be stricken with inflammatory conditions like arthritis. So this elevation of pro-inflammatory oxylipins may predispose individuals to chronic disease conditions. But what if you took these older adults and gave them muffins, ground flaxseed-containing muffins? 4 weeks later, their levels dropped to here, right? Down to like 20-year-old levels, demonstrating that a potential therapeutic strategy to correct the deleterious pro-inflammatory oxylipin profile is via dietary supplementation with flax. In 1941, the American Medical Association's Council on Foods and Nutrition was presented with a new product, ViChocolin, a vitamin-fortified chocolate bar, offered ostensibly as a product of high nutritive value, but in reality intended for promotion to the public as a kind of vitaminized candy. Surely something like that couldn't happen today, but that's the entire sugary cereal industry's business model. Right? 12 vitamins and minerals, way better than those marshmallow Fruit Loops with just a measly 11. Nutrients are added to breakfast cereals as a marketing gimmick to create an aura of healthfulness. If these same nutrients were added to soda, would we feed our kids Coke for breakfast? We might as well spray cotton candy with vitamins too. As one medical journal editorial read, adding vitamins and minerals to sugary cereals is worse than useless. The subtle message is that somehow it's safe to eat more. General Mills' Grow Up Strong with Big G Kids cereals ad campaign featured products like Lucky Charms, Trick Cocoa Puffs, right? That's like the dairy industry promoting ice cream to get your calcium. Right? Kids who eat pre-sweetened breakfast cereals make up more than 20% of their daily calories from added sugar. Most sugar in the American diet comes from beverages like soda, but breakfast cereals represent the third largest food source of added sugars in the diets of children and adolescents, wedged between candy and ice cream. On a per-serving basis, there is more added sugar in a cereal like Frosted Flakes than there is in frosted chocolate cake brownies or a frosted donut. Kellogg and General Mills argue that breakfast cereals only contribute a relatively small amount of sugar to the diets of children, less than soda, for example. This is a perfect example of a psychological phenomenon known as diffusion of responsibility. That's like every restaurant in the country arguing that their individual contribution to the problem of secondhand smoke is relatively tiny, therefore they should be exempted from the smoking ban. Right? Each and every source of added sugar should be reduced. The industry argues that most of their cereals have less than 10 grams of sugar per serving, but when Consumer Reports measured how much youngsters actually poured, they were found to serve themselves about 50% more than the suggested serving size for most of the tested cereals. The average portion of Frosted Flakes they poured for themselves contained 18 grams of sugar, 4.5 teaspoons, or 6 sugar packets worth. It's been estimated that a child eating one serving a day of the average children's cereal would consume close to 10 pounds of sugar in a year, nearly 1,000 spoonfuls of sugar. General Mills offers the Mary Poppins defense, arguing that it's those spoonfuls of sugar that help the medicine go down, explaining that if sugar is removed from brand cereal, it would have the consistency of sawdust. If we couldn't add sugar, our cereals would be unpalatable. If one has to add sugar to a product to make it edible, that should be a sign. That's a characteristic of so-called ultra-processed foods, where you have to pack them full of things like sugar, salt, flavorings, since they've had their natural intrinsic flavors processed out, and you have to kind of mask any unpleasantries in the final product. The president of the Cereal Institute has argued that without sugary cereals, kids might not eat breakfast at all, similar to dairy industry arguments that removing chocolate milk from school cafeterias would risk kids skipping lunch. He also stressed we must consider the alternatives. As Kellogg's director of nutrition once put it, I would suggest that Froot Loops as a snack are much better than potato chips or a sweet roll. You know there's a problem when the only way to make your product look good is to compare it to Pringles and Cinnabon. 7 years ago, I introduced the endotoxin theory literature, which sought to explain how a single meal of sausage and egg McMuffins could cripple artery function within hours of consumption. Maybe because such a meal causes inflammation by inducing a low-grade endotoxemia, endotoxins in the bloodstream within hours of consumption. Endotoxins are structural components of gram-negative bacteria like E. coli, and certain foods have such high bacterial loads like ground meat. The thought was that it was the endotoxins in the food that was triggering the inflammation. Critics of the theory argue that because we have so many bacteria already living in our colon, so many endotoxins just sitting down there in our large intestine, a few more endotoxins in our food wouldn't matter much in terms of causing systematic inflammation. After all, we have like 2 pounds of pure bacteria down there where the sun don't shine, so there could be like a whole ounce of endotoxin. And the lethal dose of intravenously injected endotoxin could be just like a few millionths of a gram. So we could have like a million lethal doses down there, but the apparent paradox is explained by compartmentalization. It's location, location, location. Poop is harmless in your colon, but shouldn't be injected into your bloodstream, or eaten for that matter, particularly with fat, as that can promote the absorption of endotoxins up in the small intestine, even well-cooked poop. You can boil endotoxins for 2 hours straight with no detriment in their ability to induce inflammation. You could easily kill off any bacteria if you boiled your poop soup long enough, but you can't kill off the endotoxins they make, just like you can't cook the crap out of the meat. Right? The consumption of meat contaminated with feces doesn't just cause food poisoning. Right? It can spill out during the evisceration process when the digestive tract is ruptured. Even when slaughterhouse workers trim off the visible fecal contamination, the trimming itself can ironically sometimes lead to an increase in certain fecal bacteria, thought to be caused by cross-contamination from one carcass to the next. Then, even when properly stored in the fridge, endotoxins start accumulating along with the bacterial growth. What about other foods? The highest levels of endotoxins were found in meat and dairy, and the lowest levels in fresh fruits and vegetables. But that was testing whole fruits and vegetables. Most spoilage organisms can't penetrate the plant's surface barrier and spoil the inner tissues. That's why fruits and veggies can just sit out there all day in the sun, out in the fields, right? But once you cut them open, though, and bacteria can gain access to the inner tissues, within a matter of days your veggies can start to spoil. So what does that mean for all those convenient pre-chopped veggies these days? While endotoxins were not detectable in the majority of unprocessed vegetables, once you damage the protective outer layer of vegetables, you diminish their resistance to microbial growth. So while freshly chopped carrots and onions start out with undetectable levels day after day, even kept chilled in the fridge, you start to get the growth of bacteria, and along with them, endotoxin buildup. Not as much as meat, but not insignificant. Enough to make a difference, though? You don't know until you put it to the test. What would happen if you switched people between a diet expected to have a lower endotoxin load to foods containing more endotoxin, like going from intact meat like steaks and whole fruits and vegetables to more like ground beef and pre-chopped veggies and more ready-made meals? After just 1 week on the lower endotoxin diet, people's white blood cell count, which is an indicator of total body inflammation, dropped 12%, but then bumped 14% up after just 4 days on the higher endotoxin diet. And they actually lost 1.5 pounds on the lower endotoxin diet and slimmed their waist a bit. But they weren't really eating otherwise identical diets. It looked like they were eating more meat and cheese overall on the higher endotoxin diet, and maybe getting more food additives in the ready-made meals. So how do we know endotoxins had anything to do with it? That's where the onion study comes in. A new study was designed based on 2 meals that differed in their content of bacterial products, but which were otherwise nutritionally identical. So they compared freshly chopped onion to pre-chopped onion that had been refrigerated for a few days. It wasn't spoiled. It was still before the kind of best before date. So would it make any difference? Within 3 hours of consumption, the fresh onion meal caused significant reductions in several markers of inflammation. That's what fruits and vegetables do. They reduce inflammation. But these effects were not observed after eating the pre-chopped onions. For example, here's one inflammatory marker. 3 hours after eating fresh chopped onions, a significant drop in inflammatory status. But 3 hours after eating the exact same amount of pre-chopped onions, no significant change. So it's not like the pre-chopped onions caused more inflammation, like in the meat, eggs, and dairy studies, but they did appear to extinguish some of the anti-inflammatory effects of the onion. In conclusion, the modern trend towards eating the pre-chopped vegetables rather than whole intact foods is likely to be associated with an increased oral endotoxin exposure. It's definitely still better to eat pre-chopped vegetables than no vegetables, but chopping your own might be the healthiest. In ancient Greece, the art of medicine was divided into 3 areas: cures through diet, cures through drugs, and cures through surgery. Garlic, Hippocrates wrote, was one such medicinal food, but that was to treat a non-existent entity called displacement of the womb, so ancient wisdom can only go so far. Those who eat more than a clove a day do seem to have better artery function than those who eat less than a clove a day, but you don't know if it's cause and effect until you put it to the test. Heart disease patients were randomized to receive either garlic powder or placebo tablets twice daily for 3 months, and those lucky enough to be in the garlic group got a significant boost in their artery function. A 50% increase in function, taking only 800 milligrams of garlic powder a day. That's just a quarter teaspoon of garlic powder. A 50% increase in artery function for less than a penny a day. If regular, plain, boring garlic powder can do that, what about those fancy Kyolic-aged garlic extract supplements? 30 times more expensive, and they don't work at all. 4 weeks and 0 significant improvement. It's hard to improve on Mother Nature. Garlic powder can improve the function of our arteries, but what about the structure of our arteries? Dozens of studies on garlic, all compiled together, show garlic can reduce cholesterol levels in the blood by more than 16 points, so might garlic powder be able to actually slow the progression of atherosclerosis? Garlic powder tablet versus placebo for 3 months. The placebo group got worse, which is what tends to happen. Eat the same artery-clogging diet and your arteries continue to clog. But the progression of the disease appeared to slow and stall in the garlic group. Of course, it'd be nice to see the artery wall thickening actually reverse, but for that, one might have to add more plants than just garlic to one's diet. Still, though, that same quarter teaspoon of a simple spice available anywhere may be considered as an adjunct treatment for atherosclerosis, the #1 killer of both men and women in the United States and around much of the world. What about garlic for high blood pressure? Systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials demonstrating garlic has a statistically significant and clinically meaningful effect on both systolic and diastolic blood pressure, reducing the top number by nearly 7 and the bottom number by about 5. May not sound like a lot, but reducing diastolic blood pressure, the bottom number, by 5 points can reduce the risk of stroke by about 1/3 and heart disease by 25%. Plant-based medicine can provide beneficial effects with little or no side effects, and, compared to other medicine, relatively cost-effective. I'd say so, at as little as a penny per day. According to a national survey, 1/3 of adults who've made serious attempts at weight loss have tried using dietary supplements, for which Americans spend literally billions of dollars every year. Most mistakenly thought that over-the-counter appetite suppressants, herbal products, and weight loss supplements had to be approved for safety by some governmental agency like the FDA before being sold to the public, or at least include some kind of warning on the label about potential side effects. Nearly half even thought they had to demonstrate some sort of effectiveness. None of that is true. The Food and Drug Administration estimates that dietary supplements in general cause 50,000 adverse events annually, most commonly liver and kidney damage. Of course, prescription drugs don't just adversely affect, but kill more than 100,000 Americans every year, but at least you notionally have the opportunity to parse out the risks versus benefits thanks to testing and monitoring requirements, typically involving thousands of individuals. When the manufacturer of the ephedrine-containing supplement Metabolife 356 had it tested on just 35 people, only minor side effects were found, such as dry mouth, insomnia, and headaches. However, once unleashed on the populace, nearly 15,000 adverse effects were reported before it was pulled from the market, including heart attacks, strokes, seizures, and deaths. Given the lack of government oversight, there's no guarantee that what's on the label is even in the bottle. FDA inspectors have found 70% of supplement manufacturers violated so-called good manufacturing practices, which are considered the minimum quality standards. This includes things like basic sanitation and ingredient identification, not 7% in violation, 70%. DNA testing of herbal supplements across North America found that most could not be authenticated. In 68% of the supplements tested, the main labeled ingredient was missing completely and substituted for something else. For example, a quote-unquote St. John's wort supplement contained nothing but senna, a laxative that can cause anal blistering. Only 2 out of 12 supplement companies had products that were accurately labeled. This problem isn't limited to just fly-by-night phonies in some dark corner of the internet. The New York State Attorney General commissioned DNA testing of 78 bottles of commercial herbal supplements sold by Walgreens, Walmart, Target, GNC. 4 out of 5 bottles didn't contain any of the herbs on their labels. Instead, capsules were often little more than cheap fillers like powdered rice and houseplants. In my last video, I noted that one investigation found 4 out of 5 bottles of commercial herbal supplements bought at major retailers didn't contain any of the herbs on their labels, instead often containing little more than cheap fillers like powdered rice and houseplants. At least you hope it just contains houseplants. Weight loss supplements are infamous for being adulterated with drugs. In a sampling of 160 weight loss supplements that claim to be 100% natural, more than half were tainted with drugs, active pharmacological ingredients, ranging from antidepressants like Prozac to erectile dysfunction meds like Viagra. Diuretic drugs are frequent contaminants, which makes sense. In my keto videos, I talk about rapid water loss as the billion-dollar gimmick that has sold low-carb diets for more than a century, but why the Viagra? At least the spiked Viagra and Prozac are drugs that are legal. Researchers in Denver tested every weight loss supplement they could find within a 10-mile radius, and alarmingly found a third were adulterated with banned ingredients. The most common illegal adulterant of weight loss supplements is sibutramine, which was sold as Meridia before it was yanked off the market back in 2010 for heart attacks and stroke risk, now also blamed for cases of slimming supplement-induced psychosis. An analysis of weight loss supplements bought off the internet, advertised with claims such as purely natural, harmless, or traditional herbal, found that a third contained high-dose banned sibutramine and the rest contained caffeine. Wouldn't you be able to tell if caffeine was added to a supplement? Perhaps not, if it also had temazepam added, a controlled substance benzodiazepine downer sedative found in half of the caffeine-tainted supplements. Doesn't the FDA demand recalls of adulterated supplements? Yeah, but they just pop right back on store shelves. 27 supplements purchased at least 6 months after the recalls were released, and two-thirds still contained banned substances. 17 out of the 27 with the same pharmaceutical adulterant found originally, and 6 containing one or more additional banned ingredients. Aren't the manufacturers penalized for non-compliance? Yes, but fines for violations are small compared to the profits. One of the ways supplement makers can skirt the law is by labeling them as not intended for human consumption. For example, labeling the fatal fat burner DNP as an industrial or research chemical. That's like how designer street drugs can be sold openly at gas stations and convenience stores as bath salts. Another way is to claim synthetic stimulants added to slimming supplements are actually natural food constituents, like listing the designer drug dimethylamine as geranium oil extract. The FDA banned it in 2012 after it was determined that DMAA was not found in geraniums. And who eats geraniums anyway? Despite being tentatively tied to cases of sudden death and hemorrhagic stroke, DMAA has continued to be found in weight loss supplements with innocuous names like Simply Skinny Pollen, made by BeFit with Trish. There's little doubt that certain banned supplements like ephedra could help people lose weight. There's only one problem, wrote a founding member of the American Board of Integrative Medicine: this supplement may kill you. Are there any safe and effective dietary supplements for weight loss? When popular slimming supplements were put to the test in a randomized, placebo-controlled trial, not a single one could beat out sugar pills. A systematic review of systematic reviews of diet pills came to a similar conclusion. None appear to generate appreciable impacts on body weight without undue risks. That was the conclusion reached in a similar review out of the Weight Management Center at Johns Hopkins recently, which ended with this: it is fitting to highlight that perhaps the most general and safest alternative herbal approach to weight control is to substitute low-calorie density foods for high-calorie density in processed foods, thereby reducing total calorie intake. In other words, more whole plant foods and fewer animal foods and junk. By taking advantage of the low-calorie density and health-promoting effects of plant-based foods, one may be able to achieve weight loss, or at least assist weight maintenance, without cutting down on the volume of food consumed or compromising its nutrient value. Diabetes isn't just about the amount of body fat, but the distribution of body fat. Check out these cross-sections of 2 different thighs from 2 different patients. This is an MRI, so the fat shows up as white, and the black is the thigh muscle. At first glance, it looks like the one on the bottom has more fat. That's the subcutaneous fat under the skin. But if you look at the top one, see how their muscle is more marbled in the middle with fat, those white streaks? That's not gristle, that's fat, like one of those really fatty Japanese beefsteaks. That's the fat infiltrating into the muscle, colored in red there. The green is the fat between your muscles, and then the yellow is the fat outside of the muscles under the skin. And if you add up all 3 types, both of those thighs actually have the same amount of fat, just distributed differently. and that seems to be the critical factor in terms of determining insulin resistance, the cause of type 2 diabetes. The subcutaneous adipose tissue, the fat right under the skin, was not associated with insulin resistance, so it's healthier to have this thigh. Is it possible a more plant-based diet also affects a more healthier distribution of fat? We didn't know until now. The effect of a vegetarian versus conventional diabetic diet on thigh fat distribution in subjects with type 2 diabetes. Researchers decided to put it to the test. 74 diabetics were randomly assigned to either follow a vegetarian diet or conventional diabetic diet. Both diets were calorie-restricted down to the same number of calories. The vegetarian diet was also egg-free and dairy limited to a max of one serving of low-fat yogurt a day, and the reduction in the more benign subcutaneous fat was comparable, about the same in both groups. But the more dangerous fat, the fat lodged inside the muscle itself, was reduced only in response to the more plant-based diet. So even on the same number of calories, there can be a healthier weight loss on a more plant-based diet. Those eating strictly plant-based also have lower levels of fat stuck inside the individual muscle fibers themselves, what's called intramyocellular lipid, which may help explain why vegans in particular are often found to have the lowest odds of diabetes. And it's not just because they're slimmer. Even if you match subjects pound for pound, there's significantly less fat inside the muscle cells of vegans compared to omnivores, as measured in one of their calf muscles, which is a good thing, since storing fat in muscle cells may be one of the primary causes of insulin resistance, which is what's behind both prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. Whereas if you put someone on a high-fat diet, in just a single week the fat in their muscle cells shoots up 54%, and go on a high-protein diet, and you may undermine one of the principal benefits of weight loss, eliminating the weight loss-induced improvement in insulin action, the improvement in insulin resistance. Obese individuals were put on a calorie-restricted diet, less than 1,400 calories a day, until they lost 10% of their body weight. Half were getting more of a regular protein intake, 73 grams a day, and the other half a higher protein diet. Now, normally you lose 10% of your body weight and your insulin resistance improves. That's why it's so critical for obese type 2 diabetics to lose weight. But the beneficial effect of 10% weight loss was eliminated by the high protein intake. Those extra 32 grams of protein a day abolished the weight loss benefit. The failure to improve insulin sensitivity in the high-protein weight loss group is clinically important because it reflects a failure to improve a major cause-and-effect mechanism involved in the development of type 2 diabetes. In summary, they concluded they demonstrated that the protein content of a weight loss diet can have profound effects on metabolic function. All protein, any kind of protein, if you split it up between animal versus plant protein, following people over time, animal protein intake is associated with an increased risk of diabetes in most studies, whereas plant protein intake appears to have either a neutral or protective association with diabetes. Yeah, but those were just observational studies. People who eat lots of animal protein might have lots of unhealthy behaviors. But you see the same thing in randomized, controlled interventional trials, where you can improve blood sugar control just by replacing sources of animal protein with plant protein. We think it may be the branched-chain amino acids concentrated in animal protein. Higher levels in the bloodstream are associated with obesity and development of insulin resistance. We may be able to drop our levels by sticking to plant proteins, but you don't know if that has metabolic effects until you put it to the test. I hate it when titles ruin the suspense, but indeed, decreased consumption of branched-chain amino acids improves metabolic health. They demonstrated that a moderate reduction in protein intake rapidly improves metabolic health, improving blood sugar control, while also decreasing BMI and body fat. Check this out. The protein-restricted group was eating literally hundreds more calories per day, significantly more calories than the control group, so they should have gained weight, right? But no, they lost weight. After about a month and a half, they were eating more calories, but lost more weight, about 5 pounds more than the control group, eating fewer calories. And this protein restriction, they were just having people eat the recommended amount of protein a day, so that's about 56 grams a day. So they should have just called that the normal protein group, or the recommended protein group, and the group that was eating more typical American protein levels, and suffering because of it, the excess protein group. And as a bonus, just sticking to the recommended protein intake doubled the levels of a pro-longevity hormone called FGF21, but that's for another video.